It's my pleasure to introduce Bruce Babbitt, who was Secretary of the Interior during the Clinton administration. During his 8-year tenure as Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt undertook numerous environmental initiatives affecting such areas as restoration of the Florida Everglades and the California Bay Delta, wilderness protection, creation of new national monuments, and protection of wildlife and endangered species. Prior to joining the Clinton administration, he was governor of Arizona from 1978 to 1987 and Attorney General for Arizona from 1975 to 1978. Secretary Babbitt is currently of counsel to Latham and Watkins, where his practice focuses on environmental and natural resource matters. Secretary Babbitt.
Thank you. I uncharacteristically came to this gathering with a prepared speech. I actually, maybe that's a reflection on how little pressure there is in private life. I actually sat in a hotel room in San Francisco and wrote a speech. Now, over lunch, I began a discussion with the Idaho delegation, which appears to be sort of infiltrating and determining the course of this conference, with Maveen Behan from Tucson and Dennis Eigner, and my written speech is now inoperative. If you want to read it, it'll be in the proceedings of the conference, but I got a pretty clear sense, I think, of the energy that's bubbling up and the topics that are on your minds in this conference. So what I'm going to do is practice adaptive speech making and see if I can just kind of move my way through this. Now what I'd like to do, Dennis says I have an hour, that I can do whatever I want until 2:15. So I propose to talk for about 30 minutes and then fully expect that there will be some challenges to my conclusions. I began discussing this conference some 3 years ago with Dennis and Donald Bren and others. I said at the time that I thought this would be an exceptionally appropriate place for an ingathering to kind of reflect on where we've been and see if we can project some ideas for the future. For a lot of reasons. California, a vast landscape of diversity, of interesting ecosystems, most of them threatened by development. California, as I will discuss in a little more detail, is the one state in this American Union that has the legal structure of a state-centered Endangered Species Act paired with the NCCP process, and actually is in a position to be a full-fledged partner with federal agencies. And finally, as I will explain a little further down the road, having it at the Bren School is appropriate because Donald Bren played a really pivotal role in the creation of the current federal approach to endangered species. I think you all understand that I come here just by way of laying out my own set of prejudices as a strong advocate of the Endangered Species Act. It is the most powerful, most comprehensive of all of our environmental laws. It is not confined to any one medium, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It's not a process act, as, for example, the National Environmental Policy Act. It's not confined to public lands. It reaches out anywhere where the existence of a species is threatened or endangered. And I believe that the enactment and passage and administration of this law reflects some very important ethical principles. The first one, our kinship with life on this planet, and secondly and importantly, our respect for creation. Now, I guess if I'm going to talk about the future, you must indulge me just a little bit of talk about the past, because I think there are some lessons learned in some of our experiences over the last decade. The Endangered Species Act, for its first 20 years, in my judgment, led a pretty leisurely existence. There weren't a lot, with the exception of the famous snail darter, Tellico Dam, and the remarkable Supreme Court decision in TVA versus Hill. The first 20 years were pretty laid back. A lot of science, a lot of work on the listing process, and things like that, which of course all came to a crashing end with the spotted owl, the decision by Judge Dwyer in Seattle to enjoin all timber cutting on federal lands in the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. In retrospect, that injunction was inevitable because for the preceding 6 or 8 years, the administrations had indulged the most incredibly creative ideas to try to get around the Endangered Species Act by postponing listing, by making temporary exemptions, by attempting to invoke the God Squad, and finally Judge Dwyer simply brought it to an end by issuing an injunction, which confronted me as our administration took office. The Northwest Forest Plan that emerged, I think in retrospect is going to be seen as an important historic achievement, I think for 2 principal reasons. The first one was that it brought home to the American public the increasing understanding that the Endangered Species Act is really about habitat. I think that's really sinking into the perception of this act. Certainly wasn't there at the first. We had the great good fortune of having an old-growth forest as the first habitat terrain on which to play. I mean, thank God it wasn't the Chihuahuan Desert or coastal sage scrub or, the high plains. It was the old-growth forest. I think it brought home the concept that when we talk about endangered species, we're talking about ecosystems. Not a few acres, not the back 40, but ecosystems. In this case, an ecosystem of some 20 million acres and a habitat plan which ultimately encompassed some 9 or 10 million acres. And the final lesson of the Northwest Forest Plan, of course, was multi-species. We saw right on the front end, particularly under the leadership of Jack Ward Thomas, that the spotted owl really was a canary, and that deep in that forest there were hosts of other species getting ready to follow the owl onto the endangered species list, and we better just deal with it up front. And the so-called FEMAT report analyzed some 200 threatened and at-risk species and created an ecosystem plan to assure the integrity, not just of the spotted owl, the coho salmon, the marbled murrelet, but all of the other species. Now, that said, the Northwest Forest Plan had some limits as a model. The most important one was, of course, that it was on public land. Not entirely, but the plan in its large outline was centered on national forests, O&C lands owned by the Bureau of Land Management. It was brought home to me by a guy named Pete Carell, who was at the time the president of Georgia Pacific. Georgia Pacific had a lot at stake in the Northwest, but Pete Carell was pretty philosophical. He said, Bruce, I understand that we've been cutting timber on lands that are owned by the people of the United States. And if the people of the United States don't want us to cut timber, and if they want to preserve those forests in their original state, he said, that's their right. I can't quarrel with that. And then he said to me, we in Georgia Pacific are going to move to the south, mostly a private timber base. And we think we know how to grow trees like they grow corn in Iowa. And we're going to move on to a private land base. And then he looked at me and said, Bruce, you're going to find it's a lot harder to administer this Endangered Species Act on private lands than it is on public lands, which almost immediately, as the words were out of his mouth, took us to Southern California and the listing in the spring of 1993 of the California gnatcatcher. I remember when that happened, and I remember the scientists at the Fish and Wildlife Service saying, well, nothing unusual about this listing. Habitat is just, sort of gray coastal sage scrub, and there's a lot of it in Southern California. And we listed the bird. And I had no idea that we had just laid out a development moratorium on all of the coastal plain from Los Angeles south to San Diego and the Mexican border. And I sort of looked up and thought, what next? All I'm hearing from is people in California and in the White House saying, in the White House saying, hey, we think California has 55 electoral votes. And we assume that President Clinton is going to be running for re-election. And were you aware that Governor Pete Wilson, an opponent of the Endangered Species Act, is going to be running for president? Now, sunk in the depths of despair, I received a call from the Irvine Company in Orange County, and I thought, oh, Lord. I knew a little bit about the Irvine Company. I knew that the Irvine land's 100,000 acres, an old Spanish land grant sitting right square in the coastal plain. I was aware that Donald Bren was a fairly determined guy. I was aware that he was a close friend of Governor Pete Wilson. And it didn't sound very good. But I agreed to meet, and we had a little quiet meeting in an out-of-the-way place in Phoenix one morning. Kind of anticipating the worst, I listened to the Irvine people, and they said, well, most of the industry in Southern California wants to go to court and to Congress because I think they can steamroller this process and change the act. They said, but we'd like to try to make it work. And I sort of looked in amazement. They said, yeah, really. We do open space in our developments, and it seems to us that what this is about is seeing if we can evolve a new sense of landscape which is not just open space as an amenity for homeowners, but for habitat for birds. And I sort of looked up at him and I said, well, that's all very nice, but golf courses don't count as gnatcatcher habitat. And you can't just sort of, these birds need interconnected habitat. They need a lot of it in its natural state. Well, they were unfazed by all of this, and it gradually occurred to me that they really knew what they were talking about. And so we sat down and began working on this stuff and produced a habitat conservation plan in which the Irvine Company set aside more than 30,000 acres. It's since been up to about 50,000 outside the Endangered Species Act, in a configuration across that landscape that made a lot of sense in terms of the biological requisites of the bird. That was really the beginning of the habitat planning process on a large scale. And without Donald Bren, who knows where this process would have gone. It's a process which I would remind you, I was told by the Fish and Wildlife Service last week, now includes more than 400 of these plans, which are protecting more than 130 million acres of land, an area larger than our entire national park system. Well, fresh from this surprise in Orange County, we turned southward toward San Diego, and it didn't look so promising because there weren't any Spanish land grants. What there were was hundreds of thousands of parcels of land in the hands of, untold thousands of individuals and corporations. And the landscape has got kind of a fragmented look to it. There are a lot of remote subdivisions and little communities salted across the land, and we're saying, what do we do next? A plan for 100,000 acres with a direct set-aside fine. What are we going to do with, a couple 100,000 landowners in, 1 acre, 5 acre, 10 acre plots and ranches and stuff scattered all over this county? That's the point at which Doug Wheeler arrived. He was then the Resources Secretary for the state of California. And he made an interesting offer. He said, Bruce, California has an Endangered Species Act. We have a plan or a statute called the Natural Communities Conservation Program, which you've probably been discussing. And he made an interesting suggestion. He said, we could work together as partners, and then California could kind of use state authority to translate this into the planning and zoning processes of the city of San Diego, the town of Ventura, and San Diego County. And I looked around kind of starstruck, once again, thinking, this is too good to be true. Fish and Wildlife Service said, well, they can't administer the federal law. How are you going to do this? And we discovered a section of the Endangered Species Act called Section 4D, which allowed for, kind of on the model of the Clean Water Act, if you will, allowed for a delegation to a state which had an Endangered Species Act of adequate strength and comprehensiveness, which the California one surely is. So with that discovery, we simply went to work. We got everybody together on this landscape. I confined myself to visiting the mayor of San Diego and the Board of Supervisors. They were all Republicans, and they all seemed like pretty reasonable people anyway. And all of a sudden, we were locked up in this process. And within a couple of years, we had the maps. And what we had most of all was the planning and zoning power vested in the local governments to implement the plan, because they could simply use their planning process to incorporate the biology. And then what we had to do, of course, was to figure out how to do the long-term protection. We did a fair amount of the Orange County kind of thing. If you've got a big tract of land, you do the mitigation right in the parcel of land that is the subject of the act. For the rest, I would say the majority of the county, we had to implement some other ideas. None of them entirely new, but all of them important and I think increasingly well known. One was simply mitigation fees. If somebody's got 5 acres of habitat that needs development, do a biological analysis and ask them to pay a fee, which will find offsetting land somewhere else. We got federal appropriations through Section 6, state appropriations, bond issues for outright purchases where the connectivity of the landscape was so critical that you couldn't allow any substantial development without fragmenting and breaking up the integrity of the plan. San Diego is a work in progress still, but the process is now spreading very importantly, into Riverside County, where the county planners have taken the San Diego piece, but they've now begun to focus on transportation because the poison, the hemlock to natural ecosystems is road building. And if we look at landscapes and look at plans, the first question is, what are you going to do about road building? Right? Because what inevitably follows road building is fragmentation, disruption, development, chaos on the landscape. We didn't manage to spike that in Orange County or San Diego. But in Riverside, the supervisors are working a transportation plan around this base. Before I leave Orange County and San Diego, let me say a word about Tucson, Arizona. One reason I'm doing it is because I lunch with Mavis Behan, and this is an adaptive speech. Tucson is kind of like San Diego, with one exception. When we began the process there, the Arizona government was in the hands of successive governors who were devoted to opposing the Endangered Species Act in every conceivable way. They were typical Western states. They had no Endangered Species Act, no interest in having one, no appropriations, no endangered species coordinator, and a bunch of bozo legislators devoted to destroying any possibility of these kinds of concepts. Pima County is a pretty remarkable place. The county government actually managed to get into a partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service where there could be no delegation, because in the absence of good state laws, 4D really isn't going to allow a delegation, and there's nobody in the state capitol who wanted to do with anything to do with it. But I say this for the benefit of states that are still considering this. The people in Pima County were sufficiently focused in terms of using their land use authorities that they've actually managed to roll out a plan that looks very much like what's happening in San Diego. And I think it deserves analysis, because my sort of prejudice has been that California is the only place where we're making a lot of progress because other states do not have serious endangered species statutes. I may be wrong about that. I'm certain that the implementation of the Endangered Species Act in the development context, that is, in the urbanization context, must engage in some way local governments with planning and zoning powers as the way from the null prohibition of the Act to the affirmative creation of large-scale habitat conservation plans. Let me finish up with a couple of thoughts about the Federal Endangered Species Act. It's on hard times, there's no question about it. The administration is not enthusiastic about the act. Congress has not been appropriating money. And irony of ironies, both the environmentalists on the left and the land developers and resource developers on the right have, for differing reasons, begun litigation over critical habitat, which has jammed up the system and seriously threatens the efficient administration of this act. It's particularly ironic, not only because you've got this sort of assault coming from both sides, but because critical habitat, I would submit to you, is the least important provision in all of the Endangered Species Act. You could strike critical habitat from the statute and nobody would even miss it or know it that's gone. And the reason for that is that this idea of delineating critical habitat in the structure of the statute is tied only, exclusively, to the use of Section 7, which is, of course, the consultation with federal agencies and decision makers about actions which may jeopardize species. And the fact is that you don't need critical habitat to do that kind of consultation. We've done thousands of consultations with federal agencies where there was no critical habitat delineation. And the reason simply is that the federal agencies can consult in the same way that private landowners do under Section 10. How do you do that? Well, the key thing is to see whether or not you're in habitat for a listed species. How do you do that? Well, you hire a consulting biologist, or even more simply, you just pick up the phone and call the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's the way it's done on the private side, without exception. It's the way it has been done under Section 7. Well, the courts, and that was the reason that I basically said to the Fish and Wildlife Service, look, I read Section 7 critical habitat as having a lot of flexibility in it, and rather than getting tangled up in all this, just move ahead with the real issues under the Act, which are listing, habitat conservation plans, and recovery plans. Let's just move along, consider as optional, and because it's of no significance. Well, the courts, thanks to our litigant friends, are coming in saying it's mandatory, it's got to be done on the front end. And this process is bringing the Fish and Wildlife Service to its knees. It is just a disaster. Budgets are being diverted. 80% of the listing budget is now out in these critical habitat mapping exercises. There's a requirement for abstract economic analysis. Nobody has a clue what that's all about. And the judges are just basically turning the Fish and Wildlife Service into sort of a court-ordered mapping exercise. Now, we saw this coming back in 1977, and Governor Kempthorne may have talked about this last night. We saw it coming, and we went up to then Senator Kempthorne and Senator Chafee and Harry Reid and Max Baucus and said, let's fix this. We drafted a piece of legislation which made a very simple change. It said this idea of critical habitat really is relevant in the final step of the endangered species process. After you've listed the species, gotten engaged in doing these habitat conservation plans and thinking about the minimum requisites for a recovery plan, then you really do have to know what's out there in detail, and by then you will have the science and the capacity, because you will have accumulated all that data in the course of working out the habitat conservation plans and the recovery plan. It was, simple, elegant, and like many good ideas, once it got out of committee, the leadership never took it up. I go through that because I think that it's very important that we kind of spread the understanding of that. I tend to agree with Governor Kempthorne that there isn't going to be any motion to redo the Endangered Species Act in the near future. The Congress is deeply divided, and any real motion toward modification of the Endangered Species Act would lead into an all-out debate with very likely nothing, or even worse, a substantial step back from the structure of an act which has worked quite well and produced really remarkable benefits on the American landscape. The other issue that's out there cooking, where I think we still, or the jury's not entirely in, is the no surprises policy. This one equally is a high stakes deal, and the reason is that, well, let me go back to Irvine Ranch, because The way this policy came about was really quite interesting. We were out in the middle of Orange County I think it was the summer of 1974, listening to a briefing of the emerging habitat conservation plan. We were sitting over lunch out under a grove of cottonwood trees, and somebody gets up and says, now that the Irvine Ranch is on the threshold of conveying in perpetuity an open space easement plus an endowed administration fund for the California gnatcatcher, what are you going to do about confirming that this is a deal and there'll be no more surprises? And they said, well, what happens if another species is discovered somewhere on this landscape, or subsequent facts make it look like you might have done it differently? Are you going to open this up again? And I said, no, we can't do that. A deal once struck has got to stick. There can't be any more surprises. I went back to Washington. I gathered the Fish and Wildlife people together, and I said, look, the Fifth Amendment does not appear in the Endangered Species Act. It appears in the United States Constitution. And there are very real limits to how much regulation you can do short of a taking. And I said, I can't conceive of a court allowing a second bite after as big a mouthful in the first bite. And we're going to put that in a policy. And you figure out how to do it. And they came back with quite an elegant solution. They simply said, there will be no surprises once we've put together a multi-species habitat conservation plan. If additional mitigation is needed in the future in the form of land, it will be on the government side. Now, incredibly, a district court judge last week issued an injunction involving the no surprises regulation. The meaning of that injunction is not clear at this point, and I guess I would terminate my discussion of this with a plea to the people who care about this act to support the policy and to try to send up enough sense of the importance of it that it's not going to be just arbitrarily thrown out by a judge who's listening to a bunch of environmental groups saying the no surprises policy should never have been enacted in the first place because we demand under the no-take provisions of Section 10, we think the Endangered Species Act says that there can be no habitat taken at any time, and that's our position. To which I say to the people who take that position, go read the Fifth Amendment and come to your senses, and let's try to save this policy, because without it, we simply aren't going to get much more progress. Landowners simply aren't going to be willing to entertain the kinds of deals that have resulted in these 400 habitat conservation plans. Finally, let me finish where I started, and that is, I think you're on the right track of looking really carefully at these state participation issues. I think when the ESA was passed back in 1973, the extent they thought about it, they really did contemplate a federal state structure analogous to the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. No one knew exactly kind of how that would happen, so all they did was write Section 6, which is very brief and does not have much detail in it, but it was, I think, clearly intended to foresee the evolution into a state, federal, and then kind of tiered federal, state, local participation in which the answer increasingly to the endangered species habitat issues would be an acknowledgement that what we are talking about is land use planning. It's land use planning that California has proven can work for quality housing and development, for reasonable profits to developers, and for the conservation of species. And it would certainly be, I come back to California because this is the place where it's working. It's working here because we have an Endangered Species Act at the state level, plus the NCCP. I realize there are many states where, my state of Arizona being one, where the prospects of enacting an Endangered Species Act are not imminent. But the Idaho example, I think, is important. A governor can make a difference, and states can evidence their willingness and ability to step up and share in making this work. And of course, the Arizona example, which is that everywhere in this country, local governments can make these plans work because they have the inherent powers necessary to make it happen. And I think that provides a very fertile field, even as we have these problems at the federal level for looking at a large expansion of the institutional architecture of this act. Thank you. Okay, I've got 15 minutes, so let's have at it. Yeah.
I'm Jay O'Loughlin from the University of Idaho. I have a question.
Wait, you need to get the microphone to you. Okay, we can hear you, but unfortunately the video can't hear you.
Okay. In 1999, Mr. Secretary, you were on the front page of virtually every newspaper in the country talking about a great success story for the ESA, and that was the recovery of the bald eagle and what was to be its delisting. It's still on the list. What does this say about the ESA or the society in which we're trying to implement it?
Well, it says a couple of things. First of all, the Fish and Wildlife Service, understandably, is very reluctant to let loose. They are particularly reluctant to let loose where there are not strong state laws that get to the underlying habitat problem. Having said that, I don't think it's a major issue. It would be, I suppose, yeah, I mean, I took credit for that. I admit that. I actually, now that I think about it, Fish and Wildlife Service found me an eagle that I could release and that would return. And I released that same eagle 5 or 10 times around the country. It was really great. Yeah. If you stand up and holler, I can repeat the question.
Right here, Mr. Babbitt.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties of making action at the state level work is that there's 50 states. And that in our discussion this morning, we talked about involving states. A number of the people speaking mentioned the role of states. But I think one of the inherent problems is that to make action at the state level happen, you have to work through national or federal agencies who would have a very difficult time working at 50 different levels. But I guess my question is, what do you think about the practicality of one form of a solution is to work with those states that are trying to improve their ESA regulations?
Yeah, look, there's a kind of duality here. Sort of involving states cannot mean letting loose of federal standards. That's the lesson of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. Without the backdrop of federal standards, there's no evidence in the history of resource and environmental protection that suggests that that would yield a better result. There's absolutely none, and there are good reasons for it in terms of the externalities of the costs of environmental protection. Absent a California-style set of standards, I don't think the Fish and Wildlife Service is ever going to just sort of say, well, you just go out and do it. I don't think they can do that legally. they can do a clean water style delegation in large measure here in California. I don't think that applies anywhere else in the country. So the issue then becomes working and encouraging state involvement. There are a lot of ways to do that. Section 6 grants are analogous to the Clean Water Act, and states could be lobbying for a lot more funding under Section 6, both to implement habitat conservation plans and to finance the resources necessary at the state level. I mean, I would acknowledge, even in Arizona, where we had 8 years of successive governors hostile to the act, Arizona Game and Fish did a fair amount of good work. They learned what good state bureaucracies can do, and what all federal bureaucracies have always known, and that is that secretaries and governors come and go. And you can get a lot done if you have committed biologists, and there are a lot of them in these state agencies, and they're a very good place, an important place to, for the feds to be working.
Mr. Secretary, Steve Quarles. One of the issues I think that has come up since your administration that I'd love to have a sense of your innovative and creative thought on is Section 7 consultation. By and large, when we had the Kempthorne, Bacchus, Reed, Chafee bill, Section 7 consultation had a very small portion of that bill. And at that particular time and during your term, I think there really wasn't much problem with Section 7 consultation. And at least representing the regulated community, I think there really is now. And I think it can be traced almost to one specific aspect, which is that EPA never really played ball with Section 7 consultation. We see lawsuits across the country that suggest we now have to consult on an extraordinary number of pesticides, effects on an extraordinary number of species and every conceivable kind of ecosystem. We're probably going to be consulting on TMDLs. We're going to be consulting on NPDES permits and so much more. And it looks to me that we are approaching the same kind of logjam that you suggested we were approaching in critical habitat. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, about how we might be able to address that issue.
Yeah, gosh, I wish I'd terminated this thing before Steve Quarles got a question out. I think that what's happened is that Section 7 has grown ever larger as all these other parts of the Act have become more complex. The most astonishing one to me is that the Fish and Wildlife Service consults under Section 7 with its own habitat conservation plans. Now, I defy anyone to explain how it is that the Fish and Wildlife Service usefully spends its time hauling in a bunch of people to re-examine and write biological opinions on the work that the people down the hall have spent the last 3 years putting together with their biologists. It really has a very redundant feel to it. And I guess, Steve, what I would infer from your question is there may be some of that kind of overreach out there in other areas. You heard the words TMDL. Everybody into all of that? Well, you heard those words, some of you, for the first time from Mr. Quarles. That is the non-point source section of the Clean Water Act, which is going to be the next big, not only going to be, but is, the next big piece of watershed planning under federal law. And it's going to be right up against endangered species where there are endangered species, and it's going to be operative elsewhere. Once again, California actually has a TMDL process. It is a sight to behold. I say that, sort of half out of admiration and half out of contempt. Admiration for the fact that California is really trying to do it. Basically, this is setting non-point source standards in streams, downstream, and saying this water will meet these standards, which then drives a non-point source land use planning exercise upward. It needs to be done everywhere, and it's kind of starting here in California. If they overdo it to some degree, nonetheless, it's where we're all going to have to go at some point. Yeah.
Bruce, before you came in, I gave some examples of how the existence of critical habitat changed lots of different land management situations, and most of those happened outside of a Section 7 consultation, so they weren't consultation issues. They happened separate from that. And I also gave some examples of how Section 7 consultations were canceled when critical habitat disappeared, or they were initiated when critical habitat came into being. So I guess my question for you is whether you think that viewing critical habitat purely through the Section 7 consultation, as you described earlier, is really an adequate way to understand the mechanisms, how it actually does work on the ground.
The answer to your question is no, it's not an adequate way for the reasons that I just mentioned in response to Steve's question. Does anybody disagree with my assertion that the critical habitat provision could be struck from the statute with no real-world consequences? Well, okay. We found something to disagree about. Now, but you're right. There are, I am told, court decisions where habitat conservation plans are being enjoined, work on them is being enjoined for failure to do critical habitat. But don't you see, I believe the reason for that is because litigators are going to court saying critical habitat does not apply to habitat conservation plans, but habitat consultation plans must get Section 7 review, and therefore, since critical habitat is not being done, you should enjoin the making of critical habitat plans. I understand there's also a theological dispute that goes on about this little issue of recovery habitat being delineated. All of that said, I respectfully submit that if I had the choice right now of dealing with the status quo or striking critical habitat from the statute, I'd do the latter, and we'd be back here a year later, and we'd have nothing but good news. Everything would be moving forward. Everybody would be consulting by standards that are clearly understood under Section 7. We would have freed up habitat conservation plans to go to completion, and we would have denied a lot of people a bunch of law review articles about critical habitat. Okay.
Mr. Secretary, Michael Bean from Environmental Defense. The chronology you started your speech with about the Irvine Company and the experience here in California with a natural community conservation planning process largely addressed integrating the Endangered Species Act requirements into a developing landscape situation. And the habitat conservation planning mechanism that you really do deserve the credit for using very creatively is a mechanism that has thus far been used primarily in that urbanizing context and to some extent in the large corporate timber landholding context. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on how to have more impact on what I call the working landscape of farms, ranches, and non-industrial timber landowners, where I perceive that to date the Endangered Species Act has not produced much of benefit for its goals, and yet there seems to be the potential to accomplish a lot on those lands. So I'm curious to know what your views are as to how to realize that potential.
Mike, I acknowledge that it's an incomplete story, but I think we have some very interesting examples. The HCP process in the longleaf pine forests of the south is something that, that's where I encountered you, and I think took much of my guidance in all of that process. And those habitat conservation plans really relate to the management of a working landscape, principally in terms of managing timber rotations in a way that you could have a landscape which was being utilized, but the rotations were spaced and timed in a temporal sequence that preserved enough habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker. So I think there are pretty good forestry examples. Farmlands, I think I'm going to take a pass on. I know that Mike Spear has some experience in the Central Valley with some of that. Lastly, I would refer you to the West Mojave Plan, which is now out on the street. It is a remarkable document. It covers about, I'd guess, 6 or 8 million acres. And as a template which incorporates grazing, there's not much farming in the Mojave Desert, but there are a lot of really interesting lessons in that plan, which is now on the street. Okay, I'll take one more and get out of here. It's 2:14.
Well, as someone who voted against you on the critical habitat designation, I want to just raise an issue here. I think that you're absolutely right about the legal significance of critical habitat designation, and you're absolutely right about how resources are spent. But as Holly Doremus famously began an article once, rhetoric matters. And in particular, regarding how we play this out in the local land use planning process. At those levels, just the awareness that something might be habitat for something could prove crucial to how the debate ensues about whether we're going to protect that landscape or whether we'll even look there to see if it's something we should protect. So I wonder if you could comment about the non-legal dimensions of these kinds of designations and how that plays out in the public's understanding of how we need to act more preventively through land use planning rather than just through reserve strategies or designations and set-asides.
Okay, can I have the last word? I disagree for this reason. There's no question we need a critical habitat determination. That is an inventory of everything that's out there. The problem with launching into it on the front end to the exclusion and delay of everything else is you're doing it when you don't have a good inventory of facts. You're doing it at a time when all it does is polarize everybody in sight into this abstract debate. I submit that the no-take provisions are, by and large, pretty self-evident, and that they have the, let's stop and hold the status quo effect. And that the important thing to do, once a species is listed and the land development use restrictions are in place by virtue of the listing, is to get the stakeholders together, get them at the table, get them into the process, and start moving toward the outline of solutions as a part of which the habitat will ultimately have to be identified. Thanks very much.